preachers will worship the stage. And a new manifesto. It's all questions, no solutions at all. When you're out on your own now. Always happy, smoke at your friends. Bring the darkness to daylight. Strength will flow by unity. There is a traitor in our midst, and when we rise, we will be betrayed. The other wolves in sheep's clothing take your place in the back of the flock. All this talk about freedom will be taken with blood. It's your life for this cross in your back, child. Tread the long, weary trail down in the hill. Arise! Get off your knees! Coming down, the smell of revolution on the wind. While we grind our axes, telling tales from the bonfire night. We will set out with a fire in our hearts. When this darkness gives way to the dawn, in the light we united as one. The kingdom of heaven must be taken by storm. Arise! Get off your knees! You just heard Arise from Amebix album Arise from 1985. This is British Anarcho Punk with special guest Ian Glasper. This is Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I am Jason. And yeah, we're going to be soon joined by our good friend, author Ian Glasper, who wrote the ultimate book on UK punk called The Day the Country Died.
A couple of them, actually.
Yeah, that's the one on Anarcho Punk. But if you want other punk books, he'll talk about those as well. But yeah, Burning Britain and UK thrash book and all kinds of awesome stuff.
And other things to come. So
for sure, yeah, he told us about some projects in the works that are pretty interesting. So, but yeah, so kind of an interesting episode in following up our kind of soundtrack episode and following up our In Solitude episode and following up our Neurosis episode.
Then now for something completely different.
Yeah, now for something completely different. But Yeah, a little bit about Amebix there. We're going to talk about them later in the episode, but the song you heard from Arise from 1985, we wanted to start with something because I know that this episode might be a little bit of a shock for some of our kind of more metal-inclined listeners, although I think we have a pretty diverse listening audience out there who appreciate it, Slint, and some of the things that we've done in the past. So I think this will be along those same lines and hopefully be right up people's alley. But Amebix is one of the more metallic of those bands, I would say, of the Anarchy kind of bands. And they're definitely a band that you can draw a connection, as you heard in the song Arise there, into metal bands. You know what I mean? Like that we listen to.
if you like Voivod, if you like Hellhammer, I think this is a pretty obvious next step.
Bolt Thrower.
Or lateral step,
Yep, absolutely. You know, and just kind of a little bit about Amebix that just kind of, you know, this is their debut record. You know, even though they had some EPs and things that were kind of put out before, they obviously have lots of, you know, heavy metal, lots of those kind of influences. Their motto is "No Gods, No Masters," which is a song you'll hear from them a little bit later. And they originally were, you know, bassist and vocalist was Rob Miller, and then he had his brother Stig that was in the band. And they were pretty inspired by Crass. Their first song that they actually kind of created was actually put out in one of the Bullshit Detector comps, which we'll talk a lot more about those later. And that's actually where those were Crass-sponsored comps, and Crass is a band that's kind of the epicenter of this whole episode, I think, in some kind of ways. But the Bullshit Detectors were also like Napalm Death and other groups kind of put out some of their early sort of stuff. It wasn't really a great song. It was called University Challenged, but around that time is when they met Martin Baker at a co-op, and he became kind of the new drummer, and he kind of got them into like Killing Joke and Bauhaus and Joy Division a little bit more. And then they get a guy named Norman Butler, and he comes in on synths, and somebody that I think that was friends with Norman Butler, I think might have been his girlfriend, was this girl named Kay, and they referred to her in the book as the Angel of Death, because she introduces them to drugs, and drugs becomes a huge part of Amebix's, you know, creativity, and I think to some extent their downfall. Stig, you know, he starts, you know, consuming copious amounts of drugs, and then we'll talk about a little bit later, having seizures and things like that. But Arise was recorded for Alternative Tentacles. And it was one of the first successful fusings of kind of metal and punk, I think in a really serious kind of way, for sure.
Unbeknownst to them.
Yeah.
They're just kind of doing their own thing.
I know.
It had some metallic elements that would kind of go on to be pretty, I guess, would be pretty instrumental in a lot of, you know, like Neurosis's career and
absolutely
countless others.
Mm-hmm. They had a really cool aesthetic, too. The, you know, vocalist and bassist Rob. He did a lot of the artwork and stuff, and his artwork was centered on something called Axis Mundi, which is this sort of like almost, you said, alchemic kind of belief that the point of the center of the earth was where all creation sort of evolves and things like that. I don't know a lot about that stuff, although I do have a couple like Alan Moore spoken word albums where he talks about magic and things like that, but it's definitely above my pay grade in terms of being able to like understand how it all fits together.
Yeah, I mean, I just know it real tangentially through, you know, looking into like symbology for certain things and shit like that. But
yeah, and then they, you know, they were always sort of accused of being like inspired or influenced by Venom, but they've really dispelled that they were directly inspired by them. They might have sounded kind of like them a little bit, and yeah, and they just, you know, they were kind of friends with other kind of bands that we'll talk about near the end of the episode, like Antisect, who had like kind of similar metallic intensity and things like that. So, but yeah, so I think now is a good time to bring in Ian. So we are here welcoming a new friend of ours, but a guy I've been sort of conversing with for a few months, trying to sort of set all this up. So we'd like to welcome to our show author Ian Glasper. Hello, Ian. How are you?
Hi, both. Yeah, it's good to get this happening at last. I feel like I've known you for years.
Yeah, I know, and I've been aware of you, and I'm sure Mark has as well, because I recognize your name even before I got a hold of these books from Terrorizer and you know, things like that. So I guess, you know, just for our listeners who are maybe new to all this, because, you know, they're kind of coming through like a metal lens and probably don't have some of the background that even Mark and I have, because we kind of read the books and prepared and stuff. kind of, I guess, give us a little bit of an origin story of like your entry into punk and metal and kind of how you got into writing for Terrorizer and actually writing all these books on metal, just for a little bit of background for people to kind of know your expertise.
Yeah, of course. So I was born in 1967, and the punk rock bug bit me when I was 13 years old in 1980. So I guess I was too young when 1977 came round. But 1980, I first heard Discharge. And, that was kind of like that
was it.
breaking moment. It was like sort of just wiped the slate clean. Everything that I thought was exciting and intense up until then, they just sort of ripped the rule book up. So punk rock got its sort of teeth into me then. And I guess I started playing in my own bands from about 1983 onwards. And I've been playing bass in sort of punk and thrash and hardcore bands ever since then.
Yeah, and I think I reviewed maybe Stampin' Ground when that came out in the early 2000s because, we did a magazine at the time.
I think we saw them live.
Yeah, we may have even seen you guys live, but we did a magazine after Requiem was retired in the mid-90s, Eclipse magazine. I'm pretty sure I reviewed that record, and it was awesome. But I hadn't put two and two together that you were in that band when I started to put all this. Yeah. So what other bands have you been part of then in addition to that?
Well, the first band I was in was just your sort of typical high school sort of punk band called Ammonia 77, and the first serious band I was in was called Decadence Within, and we did 3 albums and 3 or 4 7-inches and hundreds of gigs all over the UK and Europe.
Awesome.
Then I sort of formed Stamping Ground when Decadence Within folded. And we did sort of 3-4 albums, hundreds of gigs. And then I've been in lots of other bands, including like Suicide Watch, they were a thrash metal band. 36 Strategies, that were more of a melodic hardcore band. I played bass in Flux of Pink Indians when they reformed.
Oh, nice. Oh, that's really cool.
So I guess we'll be talking about some Flux music later.
Yeah.
But then I was in a band called War Wound. We did a couple of albums and a lot of touring. And I'm currently in a band called Zero Again, which is a kind of, sort of dark, heavy anarcho-punk band as well. But the writing things probably started back as early as 85 or 86 when I started doing a fanzine called Little Things, Please Little Minds. And that just gave me, it was punk, so, everybody was being encouraged to do your own zine, do your own band and stuff like that. It was very empowering. But it made me realize I could string a few words together, really. And from there, I started writing for Terrorizer in 1993. That was back at issue number 3. And I contributed to every single issue for the next 25 years until the magazine folded in 2018.
Wow, that's incredible. I didn't realize you had that long of a run. Yeah.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah, 25 years. So, I survived so many editors and publishers. But I also wrote for Record Collector, and I was reviewing a lot of old sort of punk reissues and punk books. And it was writing for Record Collector that made me want to write my first book, Burning Britain, because I kept getting sent all these books about the Clash, about the Sex Pistols, about the Damned. And I kept thinking, when's someone going to write a book about sort of my take on punk rock, Discharge, Exploited, GBH, Crass, and all that sort of stuff. And eventually I thought, I'm just going to do it myself. So I just literally wrote the book that I would want to see on my own shelf. And thankfully it really took off.
That's awesome. Yeah. I think Mark and I can relate, because him and Chris, one of our good friends, started Requiem magazine back as a zine in the early 90s, kind of right when the sort of kind of breakthrough of a lot of that European kind of metal was kind of penetrating America, early kind of second wave black metal. And so, that was my entryway into it too, was like getting to know these guys. And then we went on and did, Eclipse magazine. And then the reason we kind of started Requiem podcast is because we were like, well, the zine world has kind of died, but like, can we do something with this new medium to sort of analyze? And it's almost like our bizarre contribution to journalism in some way, because we're not writing books. So we just do kind of like audiobook kind of research kind of stuff, like a 10-hour episode on neurosis through silver and blood. You know what I mean? Like, so yeah, it's cool that you kind of had a parallel-ish journey, although, definitely way more involved and way more prestige in terms of getting books published and things like that. But that's incredible. So at what point when you were kind of putting together Burning Britain, did you kind of realize that the anarcho stuff that we're going to be talking about sort of needed its own kind of avenue, that it was like almost like too big? Was it that the fact that like everything in Burning Britain, like you were just like, oh man, this is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Do I have room for Crass and Conflict and Subhumans and all this kind of stuff? Or was it a conscious decision when you started putting Burning Britain that you were going to eventually write a separate book?
I don't think it was conscious at all to start with. And then I think when I started sort of compiling a list of the bands and it was about then that, exactly like you said, I thought this book's going to be like 1,000 pages and it's going to be too expensive. And, the people I'm writing it for aren't going to be able to afford to buy it, and it became apparent it was going to be too unwieldy. And then I had this kind of harebrained idea that, there was this kind of natural division between the sort of, I don't know, like the chaos punks and the peace punks, if you want.
Yeah, I like that.
Sort of the Studs and Leather Brigade and the sort of hippie punks. And there was a sort of divide there because, you had Special Duties slagging off Crass, and you had Exploited slagging off Crass, and then you had Conflict slagging off the Exploited. So there was this kind of division there, and I didn't want to fuel that division because I loved both camps, equally. But, just for the sake of convenience, really, I decided I was going to split the book like that. And it wasn't easy because, Amebix could have easily gone in the first book, and Discharge could have easily gone in the Anarcho book, and Chaos UK could have gone in the Anarcho book. And, but yeah, I mean, I looked upon it as one great big punk scene, but, for the ease of publishing and stuff, I decided to split it out like that. And it seemed to make sense to some, quite a few people.
Yeah, I think having read both books, I can kind of see a very distinct ideology difference. You know what I mean? Even though there are those bands that I think toe the line a little bit, that certainly could have been in both. But I think it makes sense to me, in terms of how you sort of executed that.
From somebody coming in that's not really super familiar with the scenes, I think it makes it really clear as well.
And speaking of which, I mean, I guess the premise of this is kind of like, I guess let's get into the background of anarcho punk a little bit for newbies, and kind of how it is different maybe from what most people think of as, punk, Ramones, Sex Pistols, Clash, that first wave kind of stuff. And kind of how would you pitch this to, and I think this is going to be the tricky part a little bit, although I think we have really open-minded listeners. How do you pitch this to kind of dug in maybe metalheads as to like why they should take an interest in the history of this scene and take some of it into their essence or their being a little bit?
Why it's important to
why it would be important to like metal fans to sort of like appreciate and kind of understand some of the things that these bands were doing. So
okay. Yeah, I mean it's a difficult pitch, but I mean perhaps I ought to just let you know how much I love metal as well. So although I was heavily into punk in the 80s, and I guess all punks seem to like Motorhead and maybe Iron Maiden and stuff, I was never a big metal fan. And I think I started to get into American hardcore, and from there I became aware that some bands like COC and Agnostic Front and DRI,
the crossover stuff,
they were wearing sort of Slayer shirts and stuff like that. And, I became aware of Slayer wearing, GBH shirts and English, and Metallica wearing English Dog shirts. And I became aware of this crossover. And when you think about the lyrics of bands like COC and Sacred Reich and even Nuclear Assault and bands like that, I mean, they did have a political sort of defiant, anti-authoritarian edge. So I think metal is a subculture similar to punk in that it's, a lot of people get into punk and heavy metal because they don't really fit in, with sort of normal society and don't conform with how everybody else and maybe their parents and authority want them to act and behave. And those subcultures are somewhere you can go to find yourself, and be yourself, and embrace your true sort of being, as it were. So I don't think there's a huge difference between, the basic punk and the basics of heavy metal, apart from the sort of sonic differences, guitar solos and vocalists who can actually sing and stuff like that.
Sure.
But anarcho punk, I think anarcho punk just honed in very much on the lyrics, and stressed the importance of the lyrics. And it was very much about questioning authority, believing in yourself, standing up, and speaking out for yourself. And a lot of the things that appealed to me, I was, I guess I got into punk because I was very sort of awkward and shy and, sort of bullied at school and that kind of thing. And punk was a subculture that welcomed you in with open arms, and then anarcho punk sort of it made me feel empowered, and I started to question everything, that I read in the mainstream media and stuff like that. And, people say it's a cliche when, music changed my life, but, it really did. Hearing Crass and Flux of Pink Indians, sort of 40 years later, I'm still a vegetarian. I still read between the lies when I listen to the news and stuff like that. So
yeah, it sort of shapes your ideology,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was very cerebral and had a really profound effect on me. And I think the music and the culture that you get into in your teens is what lives with you for the rest of your life, isn't it? That's always something that's very important and close to your heart.
I mean, absolutely. I think Mark and I
Certainly
are
with
still,
us, yeah.
I mean, here we are in our 40s, still doing metal related things, even though,
Sure.
I'm a school teacher, he's an artist, and
Half of our relationships are based on, people that are in the same stuff, or, I've gotten into like art through that, and that's kind of like carried on my whole thing as well.
Yeah, when I studied abroad and lived in Italy, I couldn't speak Italian when I first got there, but I could speak metal. And I actually made a lot of friendships through, like, I would wear like metal shirts and like Italians would like nod at me in the streets, and like I would stop and we'd start chatting and we just like start naming bands back and forth, and it became like a subculture language almost, you flash the devil horns and like you kind of know you're part of that tribe. And I think you're right. Punk and metal sort of share that in a lot of ways, even though they were sometimes pitted against each other, especially like in the, this era in the 80s and stuff like that. But, I think now they kind of see each other, I hope, as kind of like, fellow, kind of camaraderie and bedfellows. And,
we're on the
like
same
that.
side.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think, I think both subcultures had this sort of, this intensity, the sort of a fury and a passion and everything about it. They were very underground. So I can't. I mean, I've listened to sort of I can listen to thrash metal 1 minute and anarcho punk the next. To this day, and the harshness of the guitars of a band. When you listen to a band like Antisect or something like that, they're not. To all intents and purposes, they're a metal band with very profound lyrics.
Yes,
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah, there's such that fine line when you get to like Icons of Filth and Amebix and Antisect. It's like it might as well be metal, for all intents and purposes. But I guess that brings me to sort of like where we started, to enter into kind of the background of the band that kind of set everything up, which is Crass, and it's. I guess for newcomers to sort of anarcho-punk, and by the way, we haven't mentioned it yet, but the second book you wrote, I think the book that we're really going to be talking about is The Day the Country Died, which is the focus on just specifically anarcho-punk compared to your
the Britain book.
The Britain book. So is anarcho-punk, I guess, for all intents and purposes, not necessarily a musical thing, but more of an ideological attitude thing? Like there isn't like an essential anarcho-punk sound, is there or isn't there? I guess weigh in on that.
Well, I think I guess to an extent Crass sort of laid out their stall with the sort of the military sort of drums and the stripped down production and the intense vocal delivery, and the guitars, they were like painfully abrasive guitars, and a lot of bands took that and did run with it. So I guess if there was an anarcho punk sound, I guess that would be as close to it as you were going to get. But I mean, when you think about the huge sort of variety of bands under the anarcho punk umbrella, Chumbawamba and Omega Tribe and the Cravats and D&V and all these sort of bands, all drastically different to each other, and like you said, all united by a sort of question in ideology, but musically there were no constraints.
Yeah, because it even seems like Crass was self-aware of the fact that they were being copied and consciously like, by the time you get to Penis Envy and some of those records, they're kind of like, all right, we got to do something different because everybody seems to be just doing what we did on Feeding of 5,000 and Stations of Crass. So it's like almost like what I mean? Does that make sense? That they were kind of like,
sure.
Yeah.
They and Flux of Pink Indians to an extent did it as well. They produced a near perfect sort of punk album, Strive to
Survive. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wasn't least stuff impossible. And then they thought, we're not going to try and make part 2 of that album. We're just going to make the most horrible noise, make it really, really difficult to listen to. And if you want to get through the album, you're going to have to really work at it. These guys didn't sort of hand it you on a plate. And Crass did the same thing. It was almost like a gleeful sort of like self-destruction of their fan base sort of thing. It was difficult music.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost in the name too, right? Like, I mean, the idea of like anarchy is that like there are no rules, no expectations, and the fact that like I think that's the problem sometimes even punk in its original wave kind of ran into, right? And metal runs into that problem all the time, is like this sort of, oh, this has to sound a certain way in order to be like under this banner, but like really the innovative bands are the ones that are breaking those rules and not just adopting this kind of conservative like musical ideology or something, so
I think it's important to to push the envelope and keep reinventing and reinvigorating the sort of scene. I mean, the thing is with I guess it's the same with any sort of musical genre where you've got a first, a second and a third wave. Your second wave bands primarily listen to your first wave bands, and then your third wave bands primarily listen to your second wave band. So by the time you get to your second or third wave, they're like Crass were influenced by all this huge variety of music, but the bands that came after them were influenced by Crass, to an extent, and then you've got the third wave bands that boiled it down even further. You sort of keep distilling it, and eventually it gets narrower and narrower, really.
That's the image I sort of had, almost, is like this distillation of like alcohol, and the more you distill it, the more pure it becomes, but it also becomes like, I don't know, almost like
losing something that was
yeah, exactly. So so let's talk about year zero, because we're gonna, in this first set of music that we're gonna be playing for people, we're gonna be listening to stuff just from the first couple Crass records. And so year zero, kind of as it's kind of talked about, is 1978 when The Feeding of the 5,000 comes out. But so kind of talk about where Penny and Steve and where is it pronounced Guy? Is that how you pronounce her name? Voucher.
You said G.
G. Okay, I can. Yeah. So G and then Joy eventually sort of kind of entering into the fold and stuff. Like, where does Crass start to come together, and what made them so unique, I guess, for people that are kind of new to this? Because they, ideologically, and then the dial house stuff is really fascinating. There's all these like elements beyond just the music that make Crass certainly important.
Yeah, the record, like putting out records by other bands and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And then eventually when we get to like Crass Records and the role that sort of plays. So I guess wherever you want to sort of start and kind of telling this little mini story of Crass a little bit.
Well, when I did The Day the Country Died book, I mean, clearly for me, the most important band I had to interview, and the reason I put them first and foremost in the book was Crass. And I got to visit Dial House, and sort of hang out there for the day, and they were very gracious, and Penny gave me a fantastic interview. And I think what set them apart really is, I mean, years later, you probably realize this with hindsight, but you didn't at the time. I mean, at the time, they were just so dangerous, really. I mean, they really did offend, normal people, as it were. Reality Asylum and stuff like that were really challenging concepts for people to get their heads around. But I think, what the dynamic in Crass was like incredibly unique, because you had Penny, who was he was in his mid-30s and he was an ex-art teacher, and he was living in Dial House, this sort of, idyllic communal sort of existence. And somehow they hooked up with this sort of 15 or 16-year-old punk rocker from a council estate in London, who fronted the band. So you had this kind of youthful snarl, but you also had this sort of, more mature, very aware sort of approach as well. So, that, I think that's why they were so clever, but they were so sort of primal as well,
Yeah, because Steve Ignorant, the 15-year-old who became the vocalist, was coming from like very working class kind of background. And then, Penny obviously was more, like you said, kind of intellectual and, a teacher and a art theory and things like that. So it's like almost like this clash of these two styles together, which made them really interesting.
Yeah, the age difference is pretty profound.
And that was probably what created this dynamic. But it was Penny that did this sort of militaristic drumming. If I remember rightly, it was the only drum beat he could do, if I think rightly. And and I think their guitarists probably just put one finger straight across. They tuned their guitars so they could just play like literally bar chords. So it was really primitive, and I think that's what just grabbed you.
Yeah, because they were just a two-piece when they did the Christ Reality Asylum, which was like almost like a pre-Crass song, right? And then they started to bring in other members, if I kind of have it right.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's been a while since I dipped into all that history, but yeah, I think the band grew. The band grew as a musical outfit and as a concept, and as a movement as well. And like you said, then they started Crass Records, and and then it, as quickly as it started, it kind of backfired really, because they started to, Penny insisted on producing everything on Crass Records, so he made it all sound the same, and they made all the records look the same. It was almost like they wanted to badge badge stuff up, you know.
Yeah, and they kind of wore black on stage, and then G was the one that sort of designed the famous Crass logo. So yeah, they had almost this aesthetic as well as ideology too.
Yeah, and all the banners, and the gigs were more than gigs. They were gatherings, and I was very young when they started, but I was lucky enough to see Crass once, and it was at their last ever gig. And it was in the Welsh Valleys, a little mining town called Aberdare. It was a benefit for the striking miners.
Oh, yeah, okay.
It was Crass and Flux Pink Indians. I think Anxiety opened up. And it was just the loudest thing I've ever experienced. And it wasn't a nice loud. It was like shrill, beating feedback. And it was chaotic. It was a violent gig. There were lots of skinheads there. It was a really wild gig, and so pleased that I experienced them, because it was, it was like being run over by a train, really.
Yeah, and you mentioned, I think it's kind of interesting too, as an added layer before we kind of get back into Crass for a second, but this like element that existed just in the British punk scene in general, that there were these different almost tribes. You had like you had the Oi thing, and the skinheads, and all these sort of different kind of things. I guess for people that are new to this, like how would you explain like the atmosphere of the sort of punk scene in that era? And kind of why those groups kind of came together or like clashed with each other at times. It can kind of be confusing even for me, and I've kind of researched it a little bit.
Yeah, it was. I don't really know. I mean, it was horrendous, really, looking back at it, because I would often go to see bands, and they never got to play because the place had been trashed before the main band came on. I think I went to see GBH 3 times before I saw them play a full set.
So
it was. It wasn't big and it wasn't clever sort of thing, but there was this undercurrent of aggro at most of the gigs. There's always people throwing glasses, and there were skirmishes breaking out, and sometimes it would be that it would be punks from one town fighting punks from another town, so you could even be into the same bands. And it was like you said, it was just a very tribal, small-minded, sort of self-destructive sort of thing. It's not something anyone's particularly proud of looking back. But
sure.
You would paint on your leather jacket, Morven punks if you came from Morven, Ledbury punks if you came from Ledbury, and it was, like you said, it was very tribal.
Yeah. Almost like hip hop, like gang warfare type stuff that we in America kind of
just a lot less just more sort of cider.
yeah exactly
More spitting, less shooting.
Yes, we hope.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was just like bored teenagers, and I think it was just an extension of the same reason we used to hang around the streets and vandalize phone boxes and stuff like that. You were bored. You had a lot of pent up aggression. You needed to burn off. The music was a great outlet. The trouble is, the music was such a great outlet. What started out as a sort of a rough dance, a rough pit at the front of a gig, usually turned into like a big brawl because people were throwing fists and stuff.
Sure.
But there was the punks versus the mods, and you had bands like the Exploited sort of fueling that sort of small-minded, sort of tribalism. And Crass were aware of it, and they wrote several songs about it, and you had the music press here, the Oi thing. Sort of Gary Bushell in sounds and stuff. He had the ear of a lot of people, and they those magazines could sort of make or break, your band and stuff like that. And they did set the tone to an extent. I don't really know why.
Yeah,
it was, but I just put it down, it was small minded, and
But it seems like most of the anarchy bands were trying to like avoid that. That's something I feel like you talked a lot more about in Burning Britain. So it seems like Crass and these bands were very conscious to like separate themselves from a lot of that movement as much as they could.
I think they tried to rise above it. I mean, the trouble is, by taking hot shots at that mentality, it sort of encouraged the counter shots as well.
Yeah. So, it's like the skinheads showing up to kind of confront Jello after he wrote Nazi Punks Fuck Off and some of that kind of stuff.
And that's, it's exactly that kind of thing. And, I mean, it wasn't just here. I've heard.
Oh, yeah.
Across Europe and across the States as well.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like when we've talked to Napalm Death, that's one of the reasons they started covering Nazi Punks Fuck Off, because every time they play like Philadelphia, like Pennsylvania,
yeah, I was at a Reading,
skinheads
Pennsylvania
would always
show.
show up.
Reading, Pennsylvania show with Napalm in '96, and one of the guys I was with got hit with a hammer from some random guy in the crowd.
Yeah,
and then they played Nazi Punks and just got off stage.
Yeah. so this is just something I think that infiltrates any passionate music scene. It's people get the wrong idea. And, they're taking like the wrong cues almost from the energy and the aggression.
Yeah, so. I think anarcho punk wanted people to channel their aggression in a more constructive manner. And I think that's why I used the term, just in a sort of throwaway manner earlier, but I said the sort of chaos punks, they were, like you said, gobbing and spitting and lashing out. And the anarcho punks were more like peace punks, that they were working towards a goal. You mentioned Napalm Death. I mean, Napalm Death started out as an anarcho punk band.
Yeah, they were on Bullshit Detector comp.
Stuff.
So
they were like a three-piece and sort of sounded like, early Amebix. And,
their first gig was with Anisect, Amebix, and Subhumans and stuff like that. So they were.
They were very much a part of, and Barney, although he wasn't in the band back then, there's no original members in the band anymore.
No.
But he's carried that sort of that punk attitude all the way through the band's career.
For sure. I mean, I think it's through like Napalm that I heard of bands like, Rudimentary, Peni, and things like that, like them name dropping them or doing them on like some of their cover albums that they've done through the years and stuff. So, Yep. So speaking of ideology and stuff, let's kind of start to unpack a little bit about the music we're going to hear in this first set and some of the things that kind of jump out from some of these Crass songs. We're kicking off with Asylum and Do They Owe Us a Living, which kind of kicks off the Feeding of the 5,000. And I feel like those two songs are both pretty important in Crass history. Do They Owe Us a Living is kind of almost like an anthem for them in a sense, even if they don't want it to be an anthem. It kind of just, kind of gets connected to them in that way. But
it's an earworm too. It gets stuck in your head.
It's very catchy and stuff. Whereas Asylum was pretty controversial, right? I mean, this just like diatribe of like, feminism and all these kind of things that was, I think in 78 was pretty scary and abrasive and interesting and radical. I guess correct me if I'm wrong, but
no, you're absolutely right. I think I mentioned it earlier. I was living at home with my mum and dad, and and they were used to all this noisy punk rock swearing stuff sort of coming from my room. But when Asylum, when they heard Asylum, that was different. It was insidious. It wasn't just someone shouting and swearing. It really offended. It really offended them. Actually, I don't think it did offend them. Actually, because I had a very liberal upbringing, and my parents were sort of never held me back with anything I wanted to do, and they were, sort of atheists and stuff like that. But bear that in mind, and Asylum still shocked them.
Yeah.
I don't think anything like it. So I think you're right. It was just stark. It was, but the other thing with Crass, like you said, they really wrote some great tunes, You know, even a song like Punk is Dead, you know, once you've heard that, you can't unhear it. It's great songs. I think my introduction to Crass, like I said, I didn't get into punk until 1980. So I backpedaled to feed into the 5000. But I think the first song I heard by Crass was Big A Little A.
Okay.
And that blew my mind. You know, it was so long and there were so many lyrics and they covered so many topics.
Yeah.
And then Bloody Revolutions as well. You know, that was really profound when I heard that. And again, there were no rules in that song. You know, they threw the kitchen sink at the arrangements for, you know, for that song. And when you think Big A Little A was backed up by Nagasaki Nightmare, I think, you know, the two songs were, you know, polar opposites sonically. But yeah, Crass could definitely write a good song. And I think a lot of it was to do with sort of Steve Ignorant's sort of cheeky Cockney delivery as well. You know, very sort of likable.
That's what sort of always grabbed me the first time I heard, like, Do They Owe Us a Living, or, you know, White Punks on Hope and things like that, is like, yeah, it's that delivery that he has and that accent and all the things kind of happening there.
And
it's got the snottiness of like the Sex Pistols, but with like a more intellectual kind of idea. You know, there's something like more there. There's more substantive, you know.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm probably misquoting them, but I think Crass probably regarded the Sex Pistols as almost like a pub rock band. You know, they were great players and wrote great songs, but they were essentially, you know, entertainers. I don't think Crass for 1 minute wanted to entertain anybody. You know, they wanted to educate people.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's kind of what stuff like Asylum and you know, Where Next Columbus. I mean, there just seems to be like a lot of. I mean, they even go on the assault with like White Punks on Hope. That seems to be one of their standout songs as well, because they're calling out not just the Clash, but they're calling out all different types of political ideologies on both sides of the aisle. Like they had such intention, you know, with everything that they were kind of seem to be doing.
Yeah, they made these statements, and they made you sit up and think. You know, and even if you didn't agree, the fact that they made you sit up and think, I think was enough for them. And that sort of confrontational approach, you know, was carried on through, you know, all the bands that came in their wake, you know, especially Conflict and bands like that. You know, that's the element of Crass that they took and ran with.
Sure, absolutely. So anything that you want to say about any of these particular songs we're going to hear in this first set before we sort of dive in? We've got Asylum on the way, Do They Owe Us a Living, Banned from the Roxy, Big Man, White Punks on Hope, and then we're going to end with Where Next Columbus. Is there anything that kind of dives out to you that you want to point listeners to?
I mean, I always loved Banned from the Roxy. I mean, we're talking earworms again, but I mean, that song, you know, there's probably not many punks that can't sing that song from start to finish in their sleep, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It's just a classic song. I think the thing for me with Crass, and it's touched on in one or two of the songs that you mentioned, is they were I'm trying to think, the antithesis of the macho man mentality. You know, we were talking earlier about, you know, the guys who like to turn up at gigs and brawl. You know, Crass were the opposite of that, and I think I found that really refreshing. You know, like I said, where I was personally, you know, that sort of spoke to me, and I think that was probably what hooked me into Crass more than anything.
Cool. So let's get into it. We've got Asylum, Do They Owe Us a Living, Banned from the Roxy, Big Man, White Punks on Hope, and Where Next Columbus.
I am no feeble Christ, not me. He hangs in glib delight upon his cross, above my body. Christ, forgive. I vomit for you, Jesu. Shit, forgive. Down now from your cross, down now from your papal heights, from that churlish suicide, petulant child, down from those pious heights, royal flag bearer, goat, Billy, I vomit for you. Forgive, shit he forgives. He hangs in crucified delight, nailed to the extent of his vision, his cross, his manhood, violence, guilt, sin. He would nail my body upon his cross, suicide visionary, death reveler, rake, rapist, life fucker, Jesu, earth mover, Christus, grave digger. You dug the pits of Auschwitz. The soil of Treblinka is your guilt, your sin. Master of gore, enigma. You carry the standard of our oppression. Enola is your gaiety. The bodies of Hiroshima are your delight. The nails are the only trinity. Hold them in your corpsey gracelessness. The image I have had to suffer. The cross is the virgin body of womanhood that you defile. You nail yourself to your own sin. Lame-ass Jesus calls me sister. There are no words for my contempt. Every woman is a cross in his filthy theology, in his arrogant delight. He turns his back upon me in his fear. He dare not face me. Fear fucker, share nothing you Christ. Sterile, impotent, fuck-love prophet of death. You are the ultimate pornography in your cunt fear, cock fear, man fear, woman fear, unfair, warfare, 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 warfare. Jesus died for his own sins, not mine.
Fuck the bleeding money, is somehow I want to say. Man, I stand on nation, why not trust today? At school I give you shit, drop you in a pit. Try and get up, you can't because they bash your mouth. Then you're for example, of how I must obey. This is not the sample, if that's how you aim it. Do I owe, as I live it? Cause I do, oh, as I live it. Cause I do, oh, as I live it. Cause I fucking know that I'm whipping anymore, but I'm blow. Used to call me sweet thing, all I put is blind thing. Now that I'm different, you left the best way. You left the same come out, left the same thing. Do I owe, as I live it? Cause I do, oh, as I live it. Cause I do, oh, as I live it. Cause I fucking know. Living out is up to me, I'm never gonna get. Back at this I won't have, until it's in there. Give it a bar me, something like that. I'm gonna bear me, and for this rock, do I owe, as I live it. Cause I do, oh, as I live it. Cause I do, oh, as I live it. Cause I fucking know. Don't take any notice, what the public think. So I say it's evil, just don't wanna think. You try to target, give out to the boss. You don't wanna wear it, so you're full of vice. Do I owe, as I live it. Cause I do, oh, as I live it. Cause I do, oh, as I live it. Cause I fucking know. From the Roxy, okay, I never must supply there anyway. Said I only wanted well-behaved boys. Do they think guitars and microphones are just fucking toys? Fuck 'em, chosen to make my stand against what I feel is wrong with this land. Just sit there on their other-fed asses, feeding off the sweat of less fortunate class. Give their fucking power, cause their fingers on the button. Got control, won't let it be forgotten. Doing their reality, the wrong end ever can. Living ain't Belfast, that's the fucking fun. See you in the squaddy, lying in the front yard. See you in the machine gun, resting on the fence. Finding the action, do your rap and doing pound. Got a fucking nerves, I'm calling defense. Seems their defense is up the thread of strength. The touch upon a privilege that I had elite. Government protecting their province on the pole. Real China fortunate, shining up the dome. Find down the paper, my ass a little more. And the shit I get, 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 shit I get. The fakes, shit, it's nothing less than war. And now I'm on the government, that's what the fuck is for. Oh yes, I say it's defense, say it's decency. A lie in Hiroshima, know what I mean? Say fucking lies with impressive frequency. Say we had to do it, keep our lives clean. Who's really fucking wrong. I don't really live on that, but I've got me some. And from the Roxy, okay, never mind supplying it. Anyway, go! They tell you to do it, grab up and turn the line. They tell you if you do it, everything will turn out fine. Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes, why wonderful life? God, queen, country, can I tell you can't wife? Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes, why wonderful life? God, queen, country, can I tell you can't wife? It's great if you do it, it don't take a lot. Just means you must destroy and sensitivity you've got. Well, that's no darling, nothing's gonna get. Treat you like shit, on a current extent. Slip over the evenings, for a little slide. Little white complaints, fucking first and black and white. Lots of my phone charge for that lad who wants to know. You're driving far, or I to go. When I'm on a wheel, you're at some cunt. Turn on to penthouse with a motorway up front. The police also the chances to a bright attention lad. 20 feet of anyone, there's to be had. I was quite a range, so just on a spike. Taking off frustrations and just normal life. Some hands life in the army, the pilot's fun. Stab me and bite it, fuck them with your gun. Looks like your uniform, all right for the skirt. When you fuck them through the proper ten and then I start. Man, it's built, big game, it's the letters of the law. Man, it's built, big game, that's who the law is for. See, there's lots of chance in this land of having glory. Try and make your own rules, that's a different story. If you're a man, you better act like one. Develop your muscles, use a brick like a gun. Fuck, anything that moves, never for the price. Still, fuck, slaughter, that's the advice. Are you man enough? I can most of the rules. Have you got the takes? Got some balls. Came in for madam, we got on too long. And it's your slaughter, the blood dead drop. Big man! Big M.a.n, big man, 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 big M.a.n, big man. Big M.a.n, big man, big M.a.n, big man, big M.a.n, big man, big M.a.n, big man, J-O-K-E, big man, what fucking joke. They said that we were trash, well the name is Crass, not Clash. They can stuff their punk credentials, it's them that take the cash. They won't charge nothing in festival talk. RAR badges in their protest wall. Bands of white men standing in a park, objecting to racism, to can in the dark. Black man's got his problems, he's right to deal with it. So don't fool yourself up with your white liberal shit. If you care to take a close look at the way things really stand, you'll see we're all just niggas to the rulers of this land. Punk was once an answer 2 years of crap. A way of saying no, we'd always said yep. The moment we saw a right to be free, they invented a dividing line through credibility. The qualifying factors of politics and class left the macho street fighters with his cars. They said got a racism and came on the street. It was just a form of fashion for the socialist elite. Bigotry and blindness, a Marxist god, another clever trick to keep us all in line. These little labels to keep us all apart, keep us all divided when the troubles start. Spit upon a Jew. Vicious minus violence that offers nothing new. Left wing violence, right wing violence all seem like the same. Bullet boys out fighting, it's just the same old game. Boring fucking politics don't get us all shot. Left wing, right wing, you can stuff the lot. Keep your petty prejudice, I don't see the point. Anarchy and freedom is what I want.
Another's hope, another's game, another's loss, another's gain, another's lies, another's truth, another's doubt, another's proof, another's left, another's right, another's peace, another's fight, another's name, another's aim, another's fall, another's fame, another's pride, another's shame, another's love, another's pain, another's hope, another's game, another's loss, another's gain, another's lies, another's truth, another's doubt, another's proof, another's left, another's right, another's peace, another's fight. Fox had an idea from the confusion of his head. Then there were 1,000 more waiting to be led. The books are sober, quotes are bought. You learn them well and then you're caught. Another's left, another's right, another's peace, another's fight. Mussolini had ideas from the confusion of his heart. Then there were 1,000 more waiting to play their part. The stage was set, the costumes worn, and another empire of destruction born. Another's name, another's aim, another's fall, another's fame. Jung had an idea from the confusion of his dream. Then there were 1,000 more waiting to be seen. You're not yourself, the theory says, but I can help your complex pace. Another's fault, another's game, another's loss, another's game. Sartre had an idea from the confusion of his brain. Then there were 1,000 more indulging in his pain, reveling isolation and existential choice. Can you truly be alone when you use another's voice? Another's lies, another's truth, another's doubt, another's proof. The idea born in someone's mind is nurtured by 1,000 blind anonymous beings back to your soul. Do you feel the confusion you're lacking control? You lift your arm to write a name so caught up in the identity game. Who do you see? Who do you watch? Who's your leader? Which is your flock? Who do you watch? 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 Who's your leader? Which is your flock? 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 Einstein had an idea from the confusion of his knowledge. Then there were 1,000 more turning to advantage. They realized that their God was dead, so they reclaimed power through the bomb instead. Another's code, another's break. The shadows all in deadly rain. Jesus had an idea from the confusion of his soul. Then there were 1,000 more waiting to take control. The guilt is sold, forgiveness bought. The cross is there as your reward. Another's love, another's pain, another's pride, another's shame. You watch at a distance from the side you have chosen. Whose answers serve you best? Who will save you from confusion? Who will leave you an exit and a comfortable cover? Who will take you oh so near their edge but never drop you over? You watch, you watch, you watch, you watch, who do you watch? 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 Who do you watch?
You just heard Where Next Columbus, White Punks on Hope, Big Man, banned from the Roxy, Do They Owe Us a Living? And then we started off with the very controversial Asylum. So Ian, one of the things you hear on Where Next Columbus, and that we'll hear on the next song too with Poison and the Pretty Pill from their third record, Penis Envy, is like kind of like the Eve Libertine by this point has kind of come into the band, and there's very much this prominent kind of feminine voice that sort of exists in Crass. I mean, you even heard it in Asylum really at the beginning of that last set, but what role did sort of feminism and kind of females in punk play, and was like anarchy punk kind of a better forum to be a female in that scene, or was it, you know what I'm saying, like was there more advantages to being a female in the anarchy scene because there are more opportunities and people actually listen to you more, or were there so the same kind of patriarchal sexist kind of elements that most music scenes had in that point?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a really difficult one for me to answer as well, being a male and
sure,
and
yeah,
having not sort of experienced that kind of inherent prejudice, and I guess as a sort of teenage lad into punk, and you've got posters of Becky Bondage on the on your bedroom wall and all that kind of stuff. You know, we weren't particularly enlightened, and you know, but I think, you know, what Crass did and Anarcho Punk and Dirt were always my, you know, one of my favorite
and we'll hear them later. Yep.
Female voices in Anarcho Punk. They did make you question, you know, the sort of things that you just, you know, until that point in time you'd quietly accepted. So I think Anarcho Punk opened the doors for a lot of things, but you know, they wanted to empower individuals, and they wanted to empower, you know, females. That, you know, they wanted you to question, you know, that there was nothing, you know, that all the traditions, I guess, you know, all the traditions, they just wanted to tear them up, didn't they?
Yeah, it's like all the institutions of power, whether it be, you know, imperialism or war or patriarchy. Yeah, they were all kind of legitimate targets, it seemed like.
Yeah, I mean, Crass were I think it was Dick actually from the Subhumans who said it, and it was when I interviewed him for The Day the Country Died, and he said something that was very true. He said Crass were the first people that talked about the system. Mm. You know, this kind of you know, religion and the media and the police and authority and everything, you know, and you know, sort of parental pressure and everything. They just called it the system, and it was very liberating to be able to turn around and say fuck the system.
Yeah.
That's what Anarcho Punk sort of let you do.
Yeah, it's almost like they were taking some cues from like some of those early folk Dylan records, where he was really talking about kind of systematic things like Only a Pawn in the Game and Masters of War. You know, this, not like individuals, but like the systematic sort of structural problems with, you know, war and racism and things like that. So even though they're this punk band, they were kind of drawing from these other genres to sort of bring those ideologies in, you know, literature as well. You know?
I think that was the intellectual, you know, Penny and the older guys in the band, because left to his own devices, I think Steve, mm-hmm. you know, would have just been effing and blinding, you know, at the front, you know, by his own admission, you know.
Sure. I know, like, Penny talks about like being influenced by the Beats and Wilfred Owen kind of poetry and, you know, things like that like kind of made him more kind of self-aware of how to talk about some of those things, you know.
Yeah. Well, it was certainly very powerful for me as a teenager. So I can only imagine what, you know, how powerful it was for Steve to be a part of it.
Yeah.
To be close to them and stuff like that.
Absolutely. And so speaking of kind of those ideologies, we're finishing with two songs from Crass before we transition into Poison Girls and Flux of Pink Indians in this next set. And I guess we'd be remiss if we didn't talk for just a moment about the controversy surrounding this single that they put out in 1982, which is How Does It Feel to Be the Mother of 1,000 Dead? In the midst, or right as the Falkland Wars and Margaret Thatcher and all these kind of things were starting to happen, you know, you've got this really fascinating thing I was sharing with Mark. I actually found it in a book called 33 Revolutions Per Minute. I don't know if you're familiar with that book from Dorian Lynskey. It's basically it's a huge book. It's the history of protest songs from Billie Holiday to Green Day. And they have a whole chapter on Crass on this song and stuff. And so I thought it was really interesting. They kind of talked about the whole thing that happened with the prime minister question time when the Ray Powell, the Labor parliamentarian, like asked Thatcher if she was going to take time off today to listen to this new record. How does it feel to be a mother of 1,000 lives? And, you know, she dodged the question. And then there was a conservative guy, Tim Egger, that like described the song as the most vicious, scurrilous, and obscene record that has ever been produced and called for prosecution under the Obscene Publications Act. I mean, this seems to like put a lot of spotlight on Crass. Like maybe talk about that in a historical way. Like what did that do for the band in good ways, bad ways? Like, I don't know. Were you aware of those controversies? Like having just discovered them 2 years before, I guess give us some of those perspectives.
I mean, the spotlight that it put on the band. I mean, as far as I'm aware, you know, they did have to defend themselves against prosecution, and I imagine they had records seized and destroyed, and whatever obscene sort of publications, sort of laws or whatever. I think that probably all contributed to the sort of pressure cooker, environment that they were in that, made them split up in the end, I guess.
Yeah, Penny kind of says later, he says in many ways it was it was kind of like where the fuck does it stop? And they kind of talk about after that song that it felt increasingly like a duty to sort of just keep doing the Crass thing, I think I have a quote here. He said, yeah, it certainly wasn't fun. He says, I don't think it was ever fun, to be honest. What is fun? It's usually a waste of time, isn't it? Fun is not wanting to know. So, always Penny's always a charmer, with his dour kind of thing. But I think they talk about that song being like a turning point for them almost, So,
I think, I'm trying to recall the interview and stuff like that, but I think, they may have even had their phone tapped by Scotland Yard, and it was really sort of heavy.
Yeah.
Heavy. This was another notch up from, you had bands like the Anti-Noah League having, their So What single seized and stuff like that, because of the swearing. But this was actually, this was another level, really.
Yeah, and people thought they were like associated with Biner Meinkampf, the German terrorist group, was like getting in touch with them. I mean, they were just like they had this giant target on them almost, And
I also think that I think they were just, they were probably tired of, of the punk scene. I mean, by rights, they were probably wanting to get a message out to a much wider audience and actually affect some real change. And they probably felt like they painted themselves into a corner. I don't know, but that last record they did, was a departure, wasn't it? 10 notes.
Yeah, I mean, it was almost like a Penny solo poetry record, I think, right? From what I've read.
Yeah. I mean, I can remember not liking it at all when I heard it, and that was probably the intention, actually. They probably didn't want to sort of kowtow to their sort of hardcore fans or whatever.
Sure, yeah. So I guess that year, though, that they put that out, there seems to, from what I've kind of put together from your book and other things, that there was almost like this coalescence of everything in 1982. They call it the UK 82 phenomenon. Like, did you feel that? Like, not just from anarcho punk, but I think probably from even the studs and the chaos punk a little bit. Did it seem to be like this kind of resurgence that was peaking in like 82, kind of after the original like 77 kind of breakout, or was that just...
That was all I really knew, because like I said, I got into punk in 1980, 81, and it was a very exciting musical scene. I mean, it's interesting that the older punks that were into it from 77, they thought what I was listening to was just a noise, and that made me sort of scoff at them even more, because they didn't understand it, the same way that I sort of scoffed at my parents for not understanding Crass and Discharge and stuff.
Sure.
But it was really intense, and there were just hundreds of bands, and I think the Exploited coined that phrase UK 82. They had a song on Troops of Tomorrow called UK 82, I think.
Yeah.
Which was kind of, I don't think anyone thought of that scene as the UK 82 scene until much later when you look back at it with hindsight. But there were so many good bands released between good music released between 81 and 83, that sort of second or third wave of punk, I suppose. And it was a very vibrant time. And like I said, I didn't really think of the anarcho punks and the chaos punks or anything like that, because I loved the Exploited and I loved Crass and I loved Conflict and I loved Special Duties. I loved it all, really. I just loved punk music.
Yeah, it was like it's like Mark and I with like there were no boundaries between like black metal and death metal and thrash metal, but like there were people we met that were like, oh, I'm only black metal, and you're like, okay, I guess if that's what you're, like it's weird that you would like close those borders down. So it sounds like you were kind of the same with punk, like you were just floodgates open, like I'm interested.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I just was like a sponge, and I just absorbed it all. And there were a lot of labels like Riot City and Crass, of course, and No Future, and I just consumed everything that came out on those labels.
Sure.
But
so where does? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I mean, cut you off.
Sorry, I was going to say there was just a lot going on in 82, 83. You had sort of you had the Falklands War, and you had the miners' strike, and I guess there was the sort of Cold War going on, and CND rallies, and squatting, and the Stonehenge Festival getting trashed by the police.
Yeah.
I mean, all the dates all blur into one now, so I'm probably some of this stuff probably didn't happen until 86 and some happened in 81, I don't know, but it was just a very sort of potent it fed the punk scene.
From an American perspective, like I guess I see, Thatcher and kind of what was going on with the Falklands War was almost like fueling this punk scene the way that like Reagan and Reaganomics and some of that stuff was fueling the American equivalent, like in the 80s and stuff. Was there an American equivalent? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just agreeing that I think, and the Exploited and a lot of late, instigators and bands like that, they often portrayed Thatcher and Reagan. You would often see, the eagle and the bear, and it was the zeitgeist of the time was, we were all, a nuclear war was imminent, really.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, you had both those like crazy anti-nuclear war movies that came out. We had The Day After, and then you guys had that one TV movie that like shocked your nation. I'm trying to remember what it was called.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what it was called as well.
It was a single title, but it escapes me at the moment. But yeah, so there was this like incredible like tension and paranoia and this sort of like mass conservative movement that seemed to be like gripping both of our countries. And so, I don't know, it's interesting how that like kind of fueled a lot of the creativity, almost in opposition and stuff. So, but I guess how, where do like Poison Girls and Flux of Pink Indians, who we're going to be getting into next, because they're pretty close with Crass in some capacity, at least in, knowing them and kind of coming out of some of those same circles. Where do those two bands sort of fit into all this, and maybe give us a little background on them?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know a huge amount about the Poison Girls. I was really gutted that I didn't get an interview for the day the country died. But I mean, I remember the song they put, Persons Unknown, on the flip of Bloody Revolutions, I think it was, if I remember rightly, a split.
Yeah.
Crass.
That song seems to be particularly like potent, like it really like an incredible song lyric wise. Like it's talking about a lot of controversial events and stuff like that. That song really stood out to me when we were putting together the show. So I don't know much about the song, but it seems like a shining example of like, this genre almost.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that was the only Poison Girls song that I really, really loved. I mean, I picked up a box set of everything they did in more recent years and realised, they were a great band. But back then, that song for me, was like you said, it was such a powerful and evocative sort of song.
Yeah, was it about a real controversy that had sort of happened too, like where the police was starting to like spy on people and things like that? Is that kind of? I just got a little hint of what that song was about. I didn't know if you knew anything more about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was to do with how the police were sort of targeting anarchists and stuff like that. I mean, again, vice versa. I was much older, I think, than the rest of the punk scene. A bit like Penny, I guess.
Yeah.
When punk broke, I think Penny was in his 30s. I think. Well, Charlie Harper was as well from the UK subs, wasn't he? He was a lot older than the majority of the punk scene. But I think that's why they were so advanced and intellectual, and almost beyond my comprehension, actually. But yeah, that song was incredibly powerful.
Sure. Yeah.
Very menacing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not much more I can say than that.
No.
I mean, Vi's voice is just, sends shivers down my spine, even when I hear it now.
Yeah, how do you compare like them with like, the Slits and X-Ray Specs and some of the other kind of female-led kind of punk acts at the time? Did they hold kind of weight with them, or were they sort of seen because their associations with the anarchy thing? Were they, I don't know, do they fit into that same scene with like some of the other British kind of female-led punk bands, or do you see them as kind of an anomaly more?
I think they were an anomaly. They sort of stood on their own, and I mean, and I don't think Vi suffered fools lightly at all.
Mm-hmm.
And poured scorn on the thought of, using a sexuality to sell their music or anything like that. And I know a lot of those other bands that you mentioned, probably had the same intention, but still allowed themselves to be played to an extent by the media. And I don't think Boys and Girls played that game one little bit.
Gotcha. Well put. Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. So, and then I guess as we're about to go into this next set of music, Flux and Pink Indians, they had a relationship, I think, with Crass as well, but cool name. And I think they even kind of helped popularize like kind of the anarchy sort of circle logo, kind of getting like a lot more play, at least according to your book. I think I read that. You have association with them because you were in the band at one point when they reformed, right? From what you were kind of saying.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was kind of blew my mind, really, because I sort of learned to play bass, sort of plonking along to Tube Disaster.
Mm-hmm.
And then I interviewed them for The Day the Country Died, probably in like 2003 or something like that when I interviewed them. They reformed, I think it was a benefit gig, actually, for Steve Ignorant. And they reformed, and there were 2 nights at Shepherd's Bush Empire, this very prestigious sort of venue in London, a really old school sort of theatre. And but yeah, Derek, their original bassist didn't want to do it, or they didn't want Derek to do it. I'm not quite sure what the score was, but I remember at the end of the interview for the book, I jokingly said to Kevin, if the band ever reforms, I know all your songs, that sort of thing. And I got the call.
That's awesome.
And we did sort of 4 or 5 gigs. They didn't want to play, as soon as people knew that they were playing again, the offers started rolling in. They were offered an American tour and a Canadian tour, and people wanted us to go to Europe and fly out to festivals, and they really weren't into any of that. In fact, one of them was terrified of the thought of flying. So they definitely didn't want to fly anywhere. But I managed to talk them into doing a really, really small gig at a little club in Bradford called the 1 in 12, which is, an incredibly, well-established sort of punk venue here in the UK. And I think we charged like £3 to get in, and it was a proper old school sort of pay no more than sort of punk show. And we went and played, ironically, an old slaughterhouse in France,
Oh, wow.
called the Tanneries, this venue.
Yeah. How ironic for the anarchy punk, you know?
Yeah. And then we did a gig in London with the Subhumans, and what else did we play? Oh, Rebella Ballet. And Sid from Rebella Ballet used to play in Flux of Pink Indians. In actual fact, he played on the Tube Disaster, on the New Smile 7-inch. And he jumped up and played Tube Disasters with us.
Oh, cool. Very nice.
Told me off after for playing it so fast. Because I set the tempo for it with the bass intro.
Yeah. You tell him you can't help it. You're a metalhead at heart too. So
it's a thrash metal version. I just feel just excited to be playing it. But
awesome.
Flux were like a really important band for me, because it was their song "Sick Butchers" that really got me to think about what I was doing when I was eating meat. And it was off the back of that I went vegetarian, you know, so it had quite a profound impact on me, you know, as a person, really.
Were they probably one of the first bands, you think? I know Conflict really kind of popularized that ideology, but were they one of the first that was part of this scene that kind of talked about that and vegetarianism and things like that? Or
yeah, I think Flux were. Flux predated Conflict for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sick Butcher was on the New Smile 7-inch. I think that was 1981.
Yeah, the year before Strive, I think, right? Yeah.
And I think Conflict probably, you know, did the album with Meat Means Murder on it, probably in 83 or something.
Yeah.
So the Conflict picked it up and made it their reason for existence. You know, they really pushed the animal rights thing.
Yeah.
It was just, you know, one. It was one part of what Flux were doing, but Strive to Survive. You know, that was such a powerful record for me. I mean, you know, I loved everything about that record. You know, the presentation, you know, the gatefold sleeve, and you know, that's the beauty of anarcho punk. You know, the packaging. It wasn't just music; it was lyrics and artwork and packaging, and the whole. You know, you sat down and you immersed yourself in it. You know, and it really got you thinking. It, you know, and in the case of Conflict, it really got you worked up and fired up. You know,
sure.
But yeah, that's a fantastic album. Strive to Survive, causing least suffering possible. And I mean, what a great title to sort of, you know, live your life by as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So let's get into it. Let's finish up with Crass and get into some Poison Girls and some Flux of Pink Indians. So we've got Poison and the Pretty Pill from Penis Envy from Crass. Then we've got the controversial How Does It Feel to Be the Mother of 1,000 Dead from Crass, Persons Unknown and Crisis from Poison Girls, and then we got Progress and They Lie Like We Die, great title, from Flux of Pink Indians and Strive to Survive.
You don't exist, you never did. Hiding in shadows, persons unknown. Habits of hiding soon will be the death of us. Dying in secret from poisons unknown. This is a message to persons unknown. Strangers and passers-by, persons unknown. Turning a blind eye, hope to go unrecognized. Keeping your secrets, persons unknown. Housewives and just another day. Are they emptying the rubbish? Have the kids gone out to play? Are you waiting while the bar fills up? Watching while they read the papers? Read the headlines over breakfast. Breadlines, deadlines, has the milk come? Is it time to have a crisis? Is it safe to go out shopping? Crisis, panic buying. Water dripping on the carpet. No more, no more, just another day. Are you waiting while the bar fills up? Watching while they read the papers? Have the shops run out of rubbish? Is it time to have a crisis? Spill the beans? Take your clothes off, can you stand it if I touch you? Watching while they read the papers? Water dripping on the carpet. Can I say no? Will he hit me? Plaster falling from the ceiling. Can you stand it if I touch you? Break the ice, burn the house down. No more, no more, just another day. Shopping. Leave the kids outside the toilet. Water dripping on the carpet. Leave the kids outside the local. Strangers tapping at the window. Is it time to have a crisis? Watching while they read the papers. Peel the onion. Ask no questions. Hit the baby. Stop it screaming. Can you stand it if I touch you? Break the ice. Burn the house down. Break the ice. Burn the house down. No more. No more. No more. No more. Crisis. 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 Panic. 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 No more. No more.
You just heard They Lie Like We Die, Progress, both from Flux of Pink Indians, Crisis and Persons Unknown from Poison Girls, and then we had How Does It Feel and Poison and the Pretty Pill from Crass to kick things off. So as we kind of transition, this is one of the heavy hitters, I would say, of this scene in terms of, long-lasting, catalog, iconography of the covers and logos and stuff. So I guess set up the Subhumans and where they sort of fit into the equation of the anarchy punk scene. They seem a little less angry than maybe some of the stuff we've heard before, but I guess you can kind of maybe comment on that. So
yeah, I guess they were like the perfect combination of the two punk camps, really. You know, they had danceable tunes and a sense of humor, but they were fiercely intellectual in their own way. Again, a band that had a huge influence on me. I mean, you know, I've slavishly ripped off their bassist Grant. That was basically how I learned to play bass, was figuring out Subhuman songs and just practicing them over and over again. Well, Subhumans, and obviously for that Flux song I mentioned as well, and Warhead by the UK Subs, all sort of staples for a budding bassist. But yeah, I mean, Subhumans were, I don't know, they came from the West Country, over in the southwest of England, which is near where I'm from. And I think they came from a sort of military town called Warminster, which is near Stonehenge. And, you know, there were bands down there like Pagans and Smart Pills and A-Heads and Amebix, you know. And it was, a different kind of punk. You know, it had I wouldn't say a rural side to it, but, you know, it was a different flavor.
Yeah, it was as urban.
The other bands at the time, and they were just such. I've seen so.
Do you hear? Hang on a sec. If you can hear us on your end, pause for a
record either.
Oh.
No, are we?
Hang on.
Oh.
We're getting a weird recording
or something.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a lag.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Yep. So sorry about that.
Sorry. Actually, I had a little thing flash up on my laptop, said my internet is unstable.
Oh no. Okay.
So no shit, Sherlock. It's been unstable all day today. It's been a nightmare. I don't really know what you heard up to, but yeah, Subhumans were like a kind of slightly more fun take on the Anarcho thing.
They sort of seemed in the book too, like from what you were sort of saying, that they were kind of uncomfortable with the tag of anarchy, and they kind of thought that anarchism was like ill-defined and not something that you should really declare. It's just something you kind of know when you are. I thought that was kind of interesting that they didn't necessarily want the tag on them per se, you know? Yeah,
I mean, I guess the phrase anarcho punk is a generic tag. And I guess I probably thought I was an anarchist when I was, back then, but I clearly realised that I'm not now. But I think what Dick was sort of saying in the book was he had anarchic tendencies, rather than being an anarchist. And that, I think I don't think the Subhumans wanted to be tied down and pigeonholed. And and they went out. I mean, they were very, very clever musically, the Subhumans.
Mm-hmm. Very witty lyrics and stuff too, I thought.
Yeah, they were. And I think in the artwork by Nick Lant, that was something that was very, it caught the eye, and they came along at the right moment, and I think they were released by Spiderleg, weren't they, to start with, before they started their own label, Blur?
Yeah, which Spiderleg was an offshoot from Flux of Pink Indians, correct?
Yeah. So they would have done lots of gigs with Flux of Pink Indians and stuff like that. And
they even have a debut album, and I feel like that title of that debut album is kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's a good name for a book.
Yeah, The Day the Country Died. So yeah, I thought that was kind of a fun one. So what made you decide to name the book after Subhumans? Is it just a clever title, or is it just because of what they meant to you? Or
well, I guess I started the tradition with Burning Britain, which was named after the Chaos UK EP. Mm-hmm. And then The Day the Country Died. I mean, I thought it was a great title for a book, really, and it just came to me probably when I was driving home after interviewing Subhumans. You know, it's a good title for a book, and then the next book, Trapped in the Scene, was named after a heresy song. Mm-hmm. Armed with Anger was named after a UK label from the 90s. So I guess I'm just not very good at thinking up titles. And you're just flicking through your record collection, and you think, oh, that would be a good title for the book.
I think it's perfect.
Kind of sums everything up perfectly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think for me, Subhumans are the best UK punk band, pound for pound.
Really? Okay. So I was going to ask you that question later in the episode, but there you go. You just kind of offered it up. So are they your favorite of this whole era, or favorite all time?
Well, it's difficult, really. I mean, if someone asked me what my all-time favorite record was, I'd probably say Dirt Wears White Socks by M.a.n.
Oh, awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I've lost count of how many times I've listened to the Subhumans, how many times I've seen them, how many times I've watched videos and DVDs of them. They're right up there, a top sort of three.
Yeah. Do you have a particular song and album from them that, because we're going to play stuff from the Religious Wars EP, The Day the Country Died, From the Cradle to the Grave, Worlds Apart? Do any of those kind of stand out as that's my go-to kind of favorite one for people starting off with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at it logically, and take emotion away from it, I think Worlds Apart is their best record.
Okay.
But when I put emotion back into it, the Demolition War EP is my favorite one by them, because it's the first one I heard.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
It's the one that resonates with me. But when I actually listen to the albums, I mean, you can't really fault Worlds Apart. It's like a perfect punk record.
Sure. All right. Well, let's get into it. We've got Religious Wars from the Religious Wars EP, which is where the iconic artwork from Nick Lamp made its first appearance. And then we've got All Gone Dead from The Day the Country Died. Waste of Breath from 1984 is From the Cradle to the Grave. And then according to Ian, and I concur too, because I think that's the one I like the best so far. I've been absorbing them from Worlds Apart. What's that?
Good standout so far. That was, yeah.
Yep. We've got Apathy from Worlds Apart, and then we're going to end things with Sea of Desecration from Legion of Parasites, and we'll talk about them when we come back.
They left you to die. Religious wars
in the darkness of death. There's no light in your eyes, a cross in your grave. Your time has arrived. In the name of God they left you to die. When there just was, there's no reason why they left you to die. All is quiet, all is dead, the city has melted, the sun is penetrating through our heads. The world has ended, the gas has gone, it killed the people, none of yous live on. So long the world, that's what they say. It's 984 and it's all gone dead, 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 dead. It's all gone dead. There is no England, anarchy is right. I don't contradict or try to fight. It's always dark, there is no light. And 77 has rose to its height. So long the world, that's what they say. It's 984 and it's all gone dead, 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 dead. It's all gone dead. They shoot the floor for hanging, it causes a lot of fuss. No one trusts the government, we have to fucking sus. There are no banks left, they've all gone bust. And the houses are parliament, it's just a pile of dust. So long the world, that's what they said. 984 and it's all gone dead. It's all gone dead. It's 984, it's gonna be a war. It's 984 and there's gonna be a war. War, war, who needs fucking war? Drink, sex, cigarettes, for Cortina, household pets, bombs, wars, famine, death, and apathetic public couldn't get that. Public watches ITV, reads the sun, drinks cups of tea, a two-star family stay content, and life's controlled by Parliament. Well, now he's lost his job again, because he never had no brain. He only lives to watch TV, he's not controlled by apathy. Drink, sex, cigarettes, for Cortina, household pets, bombs, war, famine, death, and unapathetic public could have cut that. The Russians seem so far away, the government seems to be okay. The paper never mentions war, the people that it caters for have got drink, sex, cigarettes, for Cortina, household pets, bombs, war, famine, death, and unapathetic public could have cut that. The things you never knew were there, or was it that you didn't care? The biggest problem, face to face, an apathetic human race. Drink, sex, cigarettes, vodka, Cortina, household pets, bombs and war and famine and death, and apathetic public could have cut that. Well, we can always wipe it off.
The future of this fight depends on cooperation of the warmongers. Belief in liberation of the individual. And that's mutilation for these opinions they expect of celebration. Try and save this race with arms and death. Creation, so genocide for the rest. To watch it from something, a state of desperation. One is disappear in a cloud of radiation. I don't want to die for a lack of information. So first of all, this problem someone's information. Try and save a race with arms and death. Creation, so genocide for the rest. Of this race depends on cooperation, not the warmongers. Beliefs in obliteration, not the self-mutilation for things that mean respect and celebration. To watch it from Mr. Steve, a state of desperation. One disappear in a cloud of radiation. I don't want to die for a lack of information. So first of all, for some way information. Try and save a race with arms and death. Create style genocide for the rest.
All right, that was Sea of Desecration from Legion of Parasites. Then we had Religious Wars, All Gone Dead, Waste of Breath, and Apathy from the Subhumans. So, Legion, this is where we start to kind of up the ante a little bit, especially in this set of music where they seem like one of the more thrashier bands that we've heard thus far in this little journey. And they almost seem like they're drawing a lot more from kind of like the U.S. kind of hardcore scene and some of the stuff that was kind of going on there, you know? Yeah. I don't know much about Legion of Parasites. This is like, you know, you kind of recommended throwing them on this set. So I did kind of last week, I think. And so what, you know, tell us a little bit about them maybe, or why you think they're kind of essential to this story on anarcho punk and kind of where they fit into it.
Yeah, I mean, they were a great crossover band in that they came from the anarcho punk scene, but like you said, I think they picked up on the intensity of US hardcore. You know, they were, and also the thrash metal scene, and you know, they started to do. They did a couple of incredible records. Sea of Desecration's been a favorite of mine though ever since I heard it, because I'm a bassist.
Yeah.
I love the bass intro to it, which is actually Tube Disaster by Flux of Pink Indians, just played really fast.
Yeah, I remember reading that in your book that they kind of just sped it up and stuff, right?
Yeah, so and it's the sort of fact that once you know it, you can't unknow it, sort of thing. So, but it's still one of my favorite bass lines, and that track was off a Motorhead compilation. I can't remember which one. It was probably We
Don't Want Your Fucking War. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And Motorhead was a Conflict sub-label, correct?
Yeah. So it was Colin from Conflict's label, Motorhead, and they did these compilation albums, and they did a great one called Who, What, Why, When, Where. I think that's what it was called. But yeah, I mean, those compilations, there's some real gems on there, and that Sea of Desecration by Legion of Parasites is a standout for me.
Yeah, that's a fun one. And I thought it was cool, too, in your book. They talked about the name, and they just said that, you know, Legion of Desecration, or Legion of Parasites, excuse me, they go, we just wanted something that stood out, and it represented how we felt about the world in general and ourselves as parasites. So I thought that was, you know, pretty clever. So, yeah, so now we're going to transition to, I think, one of Mark and I's favorite bands that we've sort of discovered, and our Requiem listeners know them because we put a couple rudimentary P9 songs in our Neurosis episode as kind of the contextualness of like bands that influenced Neurosis to sort of do what they did. And it feels like we're kind of getting to a part of the show where we're starting to hear a little bit more metallic sort of influences kind of come in. And then I think and again, you can comment on any of these little threads I'm kind of throwing at you here, but I think what really stands out to me a lot about them is not just their sound, but also like the lyrics, that this seems much more less political in a certain sense and much more kind of like introspective, like kind of his rantings of like a mental institution kind of person and all the really weird elements that sort of add it up to this really unique band. So I guess anywhere you want to start with kind of, throwing in some kind of thoughts on this band, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, Rudimentary Peni were, like you said, they were totally different. They were like an otherworldly sort of punk band. I guess they were almost coming from like the sort of death rock kind of side of punk. I don't really know, but I mean, their first EP, I think it was a self-titled EP, but the one that opens with Teenage Time Killer.
Yeah, yep, that's from 81. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, that's such, it's such it's almost like alien sounding when you listen to that, And again, he was a bassist that really influenced me heavily. I mean, in fact, that's kind of how I play the bass, in this new band I'm doing, Zero Again. I'll send you some of the tracks because it's definitely a big nod to Peni.
To Peni.
Yeah, then they did the Farce EP on Crass, and sort of Penny made the guitars sound a bit more like Crass. And
yeah, they didn't really like the sound of that record, if memory serves.
It's very, very thin sort of sounding record, but it's got some of my favorite Peni songs on it. I do love Cosmetic Plague and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it was Nick Blinko's artwork, this sort of painstaking fine line drawings that must have taken days and days. Like you said, I mean, he had a lot of mental health issues, that have been well publicized over the years now. But, I think he was working out a lot of stuff through his art, through his lyrics. And, and then when Death Church came along, that album, again, I think it's, it's one of the sort of pinnacles of UK punk, really. And
I would agree. It's definitely one of the standouts for me,
Yeah, I mean, you look at the artwork, the fold out poster, and then you listen to it and, and just immerse yourself in, just how weird some of those lyrical concepts are about Martian churches and,
cosmic hearse, you know what I mean? It's very morbid and dark and weird. Yeah. I mean, even a song about like vegetarianism, but it's called Flesh Crucifix. I mean, that's like something, it's like something Carcass would come up with, you know? So.
Yeah, carnivores are flesh, shit coffins or something like that, they say, don't they? But I at one of my school assemblies, so at school, every year everyone had to do an assembly where you stood up and you talked about something
Gotcha.
That was really personal to yourself. And you were allowed to play 2 songs. And I did an assembly on vegetarianism. I virtually got booed off the stage. And the opening song was Flux of Pink Indians as everybody's walking in. And then the closing song as everybody was walking out was Rudimentary Peni.
Oh my God. I've had those moments before in high school where I did a poetry project and mine was on war and death because of course I was a metalhead, and of course I read the lyrics and played Angel of Death to everybody in class and talked about, and my teacher was she was of Jewish heritage and she loved it. She was just like, this is incredible. Like, I love how visceral it is. And it was like a really affirmation to get that from like an older, teacher that clearly wasn't a metalhead, that she kind of understood what I was trying to do. And I was like, yes, And I'm sure Mark as an artist, he had those moments too, like affirmation moments where you tried to like put your like bizarre interests in either comic books or music, across in like a school setting, maybe.
It didn't necessarily work too well, but yeah, it was always the most like blatant in your face. As a 15-year-old, I didn't have a whole lot of subtlety to it.
we lacked tact sometimes,
Well, I had one person come up to me after that assembly, and they went vegetarian.
So
that was, really sort of validated,
Yeah.
tried to do,
Well,
but yeah.
in the Neurosis show, when we interviewed Steve talks about like when they would play shows like on Ozfest back in 96, 97, that everyone hated what they were doing, except they would say there would maybe be like two people in the back who would actually understand what they were doing. And they basically said that they were playing those shows to like those two people in the back who were like an open book that might be open to what they were doing. And they didn't care about all the people that rejected them. And so sounds like you found that person in the back that was, connecting to what you were trying to do, So yeah, they're a really, really interesting band to me, Oh,
I love Pain of Mind. That's my go-to Neurosis record. I know it's the most obvious punk record, but actually, when you listen to Pain of Mind, you can hear there's a crossover, like a synchronicity with Rudimentary Peni.
Yeah, I think we pointed that out in the episode that we played a song from Pain of Mind. I was like, this almost sounds like that kind of riff. I can't remember what song we played. It might have been Black. I don't know, some.
And Septic Death as well. People are like, you're way off. But I can listen to Septic Death, and to me, it sounds like they're copying the first Rudimentary Peni EP.
Yeah, and they're another band too, the Rudimentary, they didn't play live very much, and they didn't really even consider themselves like part of this scene. But they're kind of, it's like, where else do you put them? You know what I mean? Yeah. So
I don't think they liked playing live. I don't think Nick was particularly comfortable.
Yeah.
And the live footage and stuff I've heard of them, it didn't come across particularly well live. It's something you want to listen to in a dark room with headphones on, really. But they've got a new record coming out, so I'm quite excited to hear that. Yeah,
that's kind of interesting. And there's such a huge gap between the Death Church and then Cacophony, like 6 years. Was it just like the nature of the band in that they kind of were just strange characters kind of coming together? It took so long to put something like that out?
I think so. I think, I think there was a lot going on behind the scenes with Nick. And I mean, I hated Cacophony when it first came out, and I've grown to realize it's a masterpiece, and I love it now. It's one of my favorite.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole like H.P. Lovecraft inspired record, which for punk is so strange, right? I mean, if you want to even, would you call these guys even punk, or are they just kind of like above it all in a weird way, like an anomaly? Because
I mean, I guess they're just Rudimentary Peni, aren't they? But I definitely tag them as an anarcho punk band.
Thematically, yep.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they were guilty by association, really, who put their records out and, the bands that they were playing with. And like you said, it was probably the only scene that would have
accepted them. Yeah. Yeah, they couldn't have hung out with like Nawabum people, that's for sure. You know what I mean? So, but.
Yeah, but no, I mean, Death Church for me, just an absolute, powerhouse of a punk record, really.
Absolutely. Well, let's get into it. Let's get through a nice little set of Peni here. From the EP, the debut, we've got Teenage Time Killer. We've got the title track from Farce from '82, and then we've got a series of tunes from Death Church, Cosmic Hearse, Flesh Crucifix, The Cloud Song, and then we'll end with from Cacophony, The Horrors in the Museum, and then the last song you're going to hear is actually from not America's Anthrax, but UK's Anthrax, and we'll talk about Violence is Violence when we come back.
Hello, Sonny. I suppose you know.
Angels visiting angels in. What's the use of looking at you and see? Always just a bit behind us. Always just a bit behind us. Following the master skull. Following the master skull as they show. One of his company bills for $100. Angels visiting angels in. What's the use of looking at you and see? Always just a bit behind us. Just a bit behind us, following the master skull. Following the master skull as they chow one of its copy bills for $100. Everything in museum, what things I'm looking at you and see. Always just a bit behind us, always just a bit behind us, following the master skull. Following the master skull as they chow one of its copy bills for $100.
Straight fight on a war 'cause my politics